But it's interesting. Xi felt he had to tip his hand and share that the greatest threats to his personal security, his country's security, are completely at the mercy of the even-keeled nature of the man on the left. Ouch. And best part, Lighthizer is in charge of the trade talks. The tripling of sanctions last Friday were his idea. The tripling of sanctions in another month are also his idea. He's the one driving this boat, and Trump loves it. All right, we're going to fly through Europe real quick, because if there is one world leader who does not understand Donald Trump, it is Angela Merkel. She came to Washington with a history lesson, thinking she could just explain to Donald Trump how Europe works, and that would do it. And he stopped her about a fifth of the way into it. She actually brought maps and charts and everything. It was delightful. There's so many things I could say about the European system, but it really comes down to this. Europe is an export union. Peace in Europe, a whole Europe, a free Europe, is dependent on the American security commitment. And without that, Europe loses its ability to export. You can see it in the demographics, why that's essential. Consumption-led growth, a recovery in the periphery is now flat out impossible. There aren't enough young people. But the same is true in the core. Now, as long as the global system persists, Germany's in the sweet spot. Lots of high value added workers. As long as they have access to an end market, they're okay. But you remove that market and it goes away, and in 10 years that bulge moves into mass retirement. This was never going to last. And if you're looking for what might be the proximate cause, assuming it's not the Americans, I strongly suggest you look at the banking sector. This is non-performing loans, loans that have gone bad. Now, in the United States, if your loan stack hits about 5% of your total, our Federal Deposit Insurance Corp comes in, closes the institution down, breaks up the assets, redistributes them. 5%. Now, those countries in yellow are Eurozone countries, and this is Italy. Here's the best part. Italy and the United States define an NPL differently. In the US, if you're 31 days late, you're in arrears, and if you're 91 days late, you go into foreclosure. NPL in the US, 91 days. In Italy, if you are 271 days late, but you have made a partial payment, you're still in good standing. That uses that definition, which means in relative terms, the Italian bad loan stack is 80 times what it was in the United States at the height of subprime. I'm not saying you shouldn't worry about Russia or the migrant crisis or the euro or consumption or demography. All of those are real concerns. All of those are system killers. But this one could kill Europe tomorrow. And there is not enough money on the planet to bail out this system. All right. The smart thing to do would be what the Chinese have been trying to do ever since Xi came to power, and steadily rein in the credit volume. But every time that happens, they see a very sharp contraction in economic growth that they find to be politically unsustainable. Remember that the people who are in the Politburo right now and who have been in the Politburo for the last several decades, they got their jobs by organizing large numbers of unemployed people and marching on the government. So they want to make sure that that never happens. So I would argue that fixing this in a slow motion deflationary, not deflationary, but like deflating the bubble, I think that ship sailed 20 years ago. And so the question becomes, is this triggering going to be internal or external? Let's start with internal. Demographically, we are going to be seeing a contraction in Chinese domestic economic activity simply because of demographics within the next 5 years. We're already at the peak right now for what that market is able to sustain. And so that would be more than enough to take what has been a disinflationary environment and turn it into a Japanese-style deflationary environment, which has all the effects for everything from asset prices to political stability that you guys have come to understand. Externally, wow. If the Russians move any faster, you get an energy crisis. If the Saudis and the Iranians go at it, you get an energy crisis. If the Japanese take advantage of their new trade deal with the Americans and try to reassert control, you get an access crisis. If the United States decides to change the rules of the game, you can pick your crisis. There are so many things that the Chinese are dependent upon the external environment for that they have no influence over. It's a little bit like Europe in that there's so many guns pointed at China's head right now, it really doesn't matter who pulls the trigger first. The Chinese economy is based on mass imports of raw materials and mass exports of finished goods. That means it cannot impose itself as a replacer to the United States in any sort of nouveau order. It could theoretically be the first of the new empires, but to do that, it needs to flat out subjugate the first island chain, and that includes Japan. I don't think that is within their capacity, even if they thought they might be able to have kind of a Hail Mary chance. The best option for China is the one that President Xi has been preparing them for, lockdown. The anti-corruption effort of his first 5-year term was not really designed to root out corruption. Any of you who have been doing business in China can understand how endemic that is. But it was to make sure that there were no powers on a regional basis that were sufficiently potent that they might be able to stand up to him once he starts tightening the screws. Because if the Chinese Politburo has to choose between a China that retains links to the international system but risks spinning apart, or one that closes itself off and becomes much poorer but can hold together. I mean, there's not a discussion to be held in China on that topic. Holding the center is what all of this has always been about. China's got 3,000 years of history, but it's only actually been a unified entity for about 1/10 of that. Half of that was under the Mongol occupation, and the other half is under the American-led order. If they can hold on to a fraction of what they have right now and remain a unified country, for them, that's a win. And then 6 months later, they sold it for like $1.5 billion.
Yeah, no, I wrote a book about it.
They were thrilled because they got half their money out. This is capital flight. Think about what drives the Chinese system: overcapitalization, a bottomless supply of endless loans at below market prices. Now, in the 1990s, this generated a huge volume of overproduction in cement and steel and other bits of construction, and China needed it then because it needed the roads and the rail networks. But by the time you got to 2000, they had supersaturated internal Chinese demand. So they dumped the products on the international market. One of the reasons why the steel industry and the rest of the world is in such shambles is because of this policy. But by the time you got to 2010, Chinese overproduction had supersaturated global demand. There was no place else for it to go. So the Chinese went out with One Belt, One Road and started building ports in countries that no one would ever go to, and building roads to countries nobody wanted to visit, and building rail lines to countries that had no consumer market. So, yes, there is a rail line from China to Kabul, and what does the winner get? This is product disposal. Or to a slightly lesser degree, it's purchasing friends in out-of-the-way places, kind of like what the Russians did in the 1990s. But as the Russians discovered, as soon as you stop paying people to be your friends, they are no longer your friends. London's advantage, the reason that London is a global financial hub is twofold. Number one, friendly business environment, very regular, very reliable, everyone knows the rules of the game. Second, they're in the European Union, so London has become the first stop for capital flight from the Eurozone to the wider world. With Brexit, all of that leaves. The Brextension process means that the reliability, the knowledge that the rules are going to be the same day to day, that is gone. And we've already seen the change in the pound and the change in dispositions of all the banks adjust because of that. That's nothing compared to what's happening the day after Brexit. But more importantly, if you're like me and you think that the Eurozone ultimately is going to implode, all that money is going to leave, and London is no longer the logical first stop because it's not within the system, it's no longer affiliated with the system, and it doesn't have the reliability that we've normally associated with London. There are limited places in the rest of the world: Sydney, New York, maybe even a little bit in Auckland, Singapore, Hong Kong. There are other places it can go. Switzerland, but it tends to be constrained, and I wouldn't bet on Switzerland. Because if this is because the European system is crashing, Switzerland doesn't look nearly as good. So you've got two fires. On the European side, there is a desire to claw as much of this as possible back. And on the American side, this is a shiny thing that the United Kingdom has that they're going to want as part of a trade deal. Now, the Americans are going to get their piece. The Europeans will get a little. But every time that the Europeans have floated the idea that they're going to force clearing on euro issues into the Eurozone, the Federal Reserve calls them up, is like, it's totally legal for you to do that. You do whatever you think is right, but just so you know that if you force euro clearing to be in the Eurozone, we will force dollar clearing to be in the dollar zone. And more trade within Europe is done in dollars than it is done in euros, much less beyond.
Yeah.
And so that tends to get knocked down pretty quick. And it's the policymakers don't talk about that. It tends to be more the talking heads. So I would expect at the end of all of this that the London financial sector is going to shrink by about 3/4, with 1/4 of it going to Europe and the other half going to New York.